I don't expect anyone to sympathize with me. If anything, I'm posting this because I've spent years replaying that day in my head, wondering exactly when a bad idea became a crime I couldn't take back. The whole thing started with a package. Not mine. Someone else's. Back then I was in a terrible place financially. I'd burned through savings, made stupid decisions, and convinced myself that the world owed me a break. Looking back, that mindset was probably the most dangerous thing about me. Not desperation itself, but how easily I could justify crossing lines I'd once sworn I'd never cross. A friend of mine worked around shipping warehouses and casually mentioned how often parcels were delayed, rerouted, or repackaged because of damaged labels. He wasn't telling me how to steal anything. He was just complaining about work. But my brain latched onto one detail: people trusted sealed packages more than they trusted almost anything else. That thought sat in my head for weeks. Eventually, I found myself obsessing over a single question. What if the package arrived exactly when everyone expected, but what was inside wasn't what had originally been sent? Even writing that now makes me uncomfortable. At the time, though, I treated it like a puzzle instead of what it really was: a plan to deceive someone for my own benefit. And once I started thinking of it as a puzzle, it became surprisingly easy to ignore the fact that there would be a real victim on the other end. That's where everything truly began. It didn't happen overnight. That's the part people rarely understand when they imagine someone committing a crime. There wasn't a dramatic moment where I woke up and decided to become that guy. It was a slow erosion of my own standards. Every overdue bill, every rejected job application, every embarrassing conversation about money chipped away at the person I thought I was. Eventually I stopped asking whether something was right and started asking whether I could live with it afterward. The package became an obsession because it represented an opportunity. I kept telling myself that whoever received it probably had insurance or could replace whatever was inside. Those lies made it easier to sleep. Deep down, though, I knew I wasn't trying to survive anymore. I was trying to justify taking something that wasn't mine. The worst part wasn't the greed. It was how normal my thinking started to feel. Once your conscience begins negotiating with you instead of stopping you, you've already wandered much farther than you realize. Looking back, I think that's the moment I truly lost sight of who I wanted to be. For days, I bounced between telling myself to forget the whole idea and finding new reasons why it wasn't that bad. It's amazing how creative your mind becomes when it's trying to excuse something it already knows is wrong. I wasn't thinking like the person I'd been a few years earlier. I was thinking like someone who wanted relief from constant financial pressure, someone desperate enough to mistake rationalization for logic. I remember staring at my reflection one morning and wondering whether I was still a decent person. I answered my own question with another lie: good people can do one bad thing. That sentence became my shield. It let me believe I was making a temporary mistake rather than changing into someone different. There were moments when I almost walked away. I'd see ordinary people picking up parcels from their doorsteps, smiling because something they'd been waiting for had finally arrived. Those moments should have stopped me. Instead, I buried the guilt before anything had even happened. That's the strange thing about crossing a moral line: you don't leap over it in one step. You edge closer, convincing yourself each tiny move doesn't really count. By the time I finally acted, I'd already spent weeks becoming the kind of person who could live with the decision, at least for a little while. Looking back now, I realize the crime started long before anything actually happened. It started with the stories I kept telling myself, but the day everything unfolded didn't feel dramatic at first. It was strangely ordinary. People were going about their routines, traffic moved as usual, and nothing about the morning suggested it would become one of the defining memories of my life. That normality was unsettling. I'd always imagined that doing something seriously wrong would feel obvious, like crossing an invisible barrier. Instead, it felt like any other day. Right up until I realized there was no turning back. What caught me off guard wasn't the situation itself, but my own reaction. I expected to feel excitement or panic immediately. Instead, I felt almost detached, as if I were watching someone else make terrible decisions. That numbness lasted only a short while. Once I understood that another person would eventually discover something wasn't right, the weight of what I'd done settled in all at once. Every passing stranger suddenly looked suspicious to me, even though no one had any reason to pay attention. A simple glance from someone walking by felt like an accusation. I started imagining conversations that hadn't happened, questions nobody had asked, consequences that hadn't arrived yet. Fear has a way of filling silence with its own stories. By the end of that day, I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't relieved. I was simply waiting, knowing that sooner or later someone else would have to deal with the confusion I'd caused. That realization followed me home and stayed with me long after the adrenaline disappeared. People think the hardest part is the moment you do something wrong. For me, it was the waiting afterward. Life carried on as if nothing had happened. I went through my normal routine, answered messages, bought groceries, even joked with people at work. On the outside, I looked exactly the same. Inside, though, every notification on my phone made my stomach tighten. Every unknown number felt like it might be the call that exposed everything. I became obsessed with imagining the person expecting that package. I pictured them opening it with excitement, only to pause in confusion. Then confusion turning into frustration. Then anger. That image kept replaying in my mind, growing more vivid each time. Until then, the whole situation had felt abstract. Now there was a real person on the receiving end of my decision, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. Ironically, nobody confronted me. No dramatic knock on the door. No accusations. That silence was somehow worse. Without any answers, my imagination supplied every possible outcome. I started seeing guilt where there probably wasn't any, strangers looking in my direction, neighbors chatting outside, coworkers asking perfectly ordinary questions. I slept poorly for weeks. Every morning I woke up hoping the feeling would fade, and every night it returned a little stronger. I had gotten away with it, at least on the surface, but instead of feeling victorious, I felt trapped by my own thoughts. That was when I began to realize that escaping consequences isn't the same as escaping yourself. After a while, something strange happened. The fear didn't disappear, it changed. Instead of expecting to be caught every day, I started carrying the secret around like an extra piece of luggage. It followed me everywhere, even during moments that had nothing to do with what I'd done. Whenever people talked about honesty or trust, I'd go quiet. If someone mentioned a missing delivery or a customer service nightmare, my heart would skip a beat, even though their story had nothing to do with mine. I kept wondering whether they could somehow see it on my face. Of course they couldn't, but guilt has a way of making you believe you're transparent. I also noticed how much energy it took to maintain the version of myself everyone else believed in. Friends still thought I was reliable. Family still trusted me. Every compliment about my character felt undeserved, and accepting it made me feel worse than hearing criticism ever could. That's when I understood something I wish I'd realized sooner: the biggest lie wasn't the one tied to the package. It was pretending that one dishonest choice could stay isolated from the rest of my life. It couldn't. It quietly influenced how I saw myself, how I spoke to others, and how comfortable I felt in my own skin. Even now, years later, I don't remember that period as the time I got away with it. I remember it as the time I slowly became a stranger to myself. That's a much heavier consequence. A few months later, I was having coffee with an old friend when the topic of deliveries came up completely by chance. He mentioned how his cousin had received the wrong contents in a package and spent weeks trying to sort everything out with customer support. He laughed about how absurd the situation was. I didn't. I just sat there, stirring my coffee long after the sugar had dissolved. He kept talking about how frustrating it must have been for the recipient, especially because the missing item wasn't just expensive, it had sentimental value. Those words landed harder than anything else I'd heard since my own mistake. Until then, I'd focused mostly on money, on consequences for me, on whether I'd be discovered. I hadn't spent enough time thinking about what the other person might have lost beyond the price tag. I nodded through the conversation, hoping my face wasn't giving anything away. The guilt came rushing back, stronger than it had been in weeks. I remember leaving the cafe with the uncomfortable realization that real victims don't disappear just because you stop thinking about them. That evening, I couldn't distract myself. The television stayed off, my phone stayed on the table, and I just sat in silence. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I could keep my secret. Instead, I started wondering whether I deserved to. It was a difficult question, and I wasn't ready to answer it. After that conversation, I convinced myself the only thing I could do was keep living my life and try to become a better person. It sounds noble when I say it now, but at the time it was also a convenient excuse. Improving myself felt easier than confronting what I'd done. I volunteered more often, helped friends when they needed it, and tried to be the dependable person everyone believed I already was. The problem was that good deeds didn't erase the memory. They simply existed alongside it. Every now and then I'd catch myself thinking about the package without warning. It could happen while standing in line at a store or watching a courier leave a parcel on someone's porch. A perfectly ordinary moment would pull me straight back to that chapter of my life. My chest would tighten, and I'd wonder if the recipient had ever received an explanation or if they simply accepted that sometimes bad things happen for no reason. Over time, I realized guilt doesn't keep a schedule. It fades for weeks, then returns because of a random conversation, a familiar sound, or a passing memory. You never know when it will show up. Looking back, I think that uncertainty became part of the punishment. I wasn't living in constant fear anymore, but I was never completely free of it either. The experience left a permanent mark on the way I thought about trust, and once trust is damaged, even your trust in yourself, it takes far longer to rebuild than I ever imagined. Years have passed since then, and distance has a strange way of stripping away excuses. The reasons I clung to back then, money, stress, frustration, don't seem nearly as convincing anymore. They explain why I was vulnerable to making a terrible decision, but they don't justify it. What bothers me most isn't the single act itself. It's realizing how easily I allowed myself to blur the line between desperation and entitlement. I kept telling myself I deserved a break because life had been unfair. The truth was that plenty of people were struggling without choosing to betray someone else's trust. I've replayed those days more times than I can count, wondering what would have happened if I'd stopped myself earlier. Maybe nothing dramatic. Maybe I would have stayed broke for a while longer. Maybe I would have been embarrassed asking for help. Looking back, any of those outcomes would have been easier to live with than carrying the memory I have now. People sometimes ask whether guilt fades with time. In my experience, it changes shape rather than disappearing. It's quieter than it used to be, but it's also deeper. It has become less about fear of consequences and more about accepting that one choice can permanently alter how you see yourself. That's the hardest lesson I've learned. Your reputation can recover, other people may forgive you or never even know, but rebuilding your own respect for yourself is a much longer journey. And unlike everything else, there's no shortcut for that. If you've made it this far, you might be expecting some dramatic twist, that I was arrested years later, or that someone eventually connected the dots. That's not what happened. The ending is quieter than that, and in some ways, it's more unsettling. I wasn't forced to confront my actions by detectives or a courtroom. I had to confront them every time I thought about the kind of person I wanted to be. That became the real consequence. It wasn't constant, but it was persistent, surfacing during milestones in my life when I wanted to believe I'd become someone better. As I got older, I began to understand that trust is incredibly fragile. People hand it to you without thinking, assuming you'll respect it. Once you choose to abuse that trust, even in a way nobody else ever discovers, you've still crossed a line within yourself. That's the part one underestimated. If anyone reading this is standing at the edge of a decision they're trying to justify, I'd ask them to pause and imagine not just the immediate outcome, but the years afterward. Ask yourself whether the temporary relief is worth carrying a memory that resurfaces when you least expect it. For me, the answer became obvious, but only after it was far too late to change what I'd already done. I've told myself this story countless times over the years, and every version ends the same way. Not with a dramatic chase or a shocking confession, but with an ordinary man realizing that one decision can quietly reshape the rest of his life. People often imagine guilt as something loud and overwhelming. Mine wasn't. It settled into the background like a faint noise you eventually stop noticing until everything goes quiet, and suddenly it's the only thing you can hear. Birthdays, family gatherings, moments of success, even simple evenings at home occasionally brought the memory back without warning. The strangest part is that life didn't stop because of what I did. I found work, built relationships, and had reasons to smile again. Yet every positive step also reminded me that I had once been willing to sacrifice someone else's peace of mind for my own convenience. That contrast never completely disappeared. I don't believe one mistake defines an entire person forever, but I do believe we're responsible for what we choose to do after it. I couldn't erase the past, but I could stop pretending it wasn't part of me. Accepting that was painful, yet it was also the first honest thing I'd done about the whole situation in a very long time. So why write about it now? Not because I'm looking for sympathy. And not because confessing to strangers magically makes anything better. If anything, putting these words down forces me to revisit a version of myself I'd rather leave behind. I'm writing because silence has a way of turning memories into something distorted. For years, I either minimized what happened or avoided thinking about it altogether. Neither approach helped. Ignoring it didn't erase the lesson, and excusing it only delayed accepting responsibility. I also know there are people reading forums like this who are under enormous pressure. Financially, emotionally, or both. I remember exactly how easy it felt to convince myself that one dishonest decision would solve everything. What I didn't understand was that problems have a habit of changing shape. The financial stress eventually passed, but the memory stayed. If there's one thing I hope someone takes from my story, it's this: when you're desperate, your own mind can become your worst advisor. It'll offer comforting explanations, convenient excuses, and promises that everything will work out. Listen carefully enough, though, and you'll notice those excuses always benefit only one person: you. I learned that far too late. I hope someone else doesn't have to. When I read over everything I've written, I'm tempted to soften the edges of the story. To remind everyone how stressed I was, how overwhelmed I felt, or how convinced I had become that I had no good options left. But every time I start doing that, I catch myself slipping back into the same habit that got me into trouble in the first place, looking for excuses instead of accepting responsibility. The truth is simple, even if it's uncomfortable. Someone trusted that what they sent would reach its destination unchanged. That trust was broken. Whether the consequences were small or significant doesn't really matter anymore. The fact that another person had to deal with confusion and frustration because of my decision is enough. I've spent years trying to become someone who values honesty more than convenience. I won't pretend I've become perfect. No one does overnight. But I can say that facing my past honestly has changed the way I approach every difficult decision since then. If I have one regret beyond the obvious, it's realizing how many chances I had to stop before things reached that point. Looking back, there wasn't one defining moment where everything became inevitable. There were dozens of opportunities to walk away. I ignored every one of them, and that's something I'll always have to live with. If you're reading this because you're in a desperate situation and you're trying to convince yourself that just this once won't matter, I hope you'll take a lesson from someone who already made that mistake. The relief you're imagining is real, but it's temporary. The consequences aren't always dramatic, and that's almost worse. You may never face a courtroom or public humiliation. You may never have anyone point a finger at you. But you'll still have to live with the version of yourself that made the choice, and that's a conversation you can't avoid forever. I used to think integrity was something you either had or didn't have. Now I see it differently. It's something built from hundreds of ordinary decisions, especially when no one is watching. One poor decision doesn't erase every good thing you've ever done, but it does leave a mark. What matters afterward is whether you're willing to admit it, learn from it, and refuse to repeat it. I can't rewrite my own story. The package, the lies I told myself, the weeks of anxiety, they're all part of my past now. But maybe by being honest about it, I can stop someone else from making a choice they'll spend years trying to understand. If this confession accomplishes even that much, then sharing it wasn't pointless. I don't expect forgiveness from strangers on the internet. Some of you will probably think I deserve to be caught. Others might believe I've punished myself enough. Honestly, neither opinion changes what happened. The past doesn't become lighter because people agree or disagree with you. What I can say is that this experience permanently changed the way I look at trust. Every package on a doorstep, every person handing something valuable to someone else, every small act of everyday confidence between strangers reminds me that society works because most people choose not to betray one another. I became one of the exceptions, and that's not something I'm proud of. Over the years, I've tried to make different choices, not because they erase the old one, but because they're the only choices I still have control over. Regret is useful only if it changes your future behavior. Otherwise, it's just another story you tell yourself. So that's my confession. Not a tale about getting rich, beating the system, or pulling off some clever scheme. It's a story about how easy it is to justify crossing a line, how difficult it is to live with that decision afterward, and how much harder it is to rebuild your own sense of integrity than it is to lose it. If you've ever found yourself tempted to solve a problem through dishonesty, learn from my mistake instead of repeating it. The short-term gain fades surprisingly quickly. The memory doesn't.